Welcome once again to Captain Fred's Aviation Theater. Today we're visiting with Scott Royce, who is here as a part of the B-24 Liberator Convention. And Scott was actually involved in the early days of the Liberator. Let's start with Major Reuben Fleet, the first or one of the first airmail pilots. In, did you say 1924 was the year?
I believe in 24 he flew some airmail from Washington to New York and returned and was greeted by President Coolidge at the time.
I've seen footage of that landing. He actually rolled up the White House steps a little bit. And then you said he borrowed some money.
He borrowed some money from his sister and bought into the Gaudelet Airplane Company, which later expanded and changed and became Consolidated Aircraft.
And that was in Buffalo, New York.
Buffalo, New York.
Way up on the St. Lawrence River, almost in Canada.
Yes, near Niagara Falls.
Yes. And
actually it was in Tonawanda, a suburb of Buffalo.
Oh, is that right?
When I was in high school, I would go out in the summertime and work in the various departments, the wing department and so forth.
Then 1936, he moved to San Diego. Tell our viewers why he made that move.
Well, he had gotten into large seaplanes, and Buffalo was icebound a large part of the year. He wanted a place where he could fly his seaplanes.
And he got a contract for the Navy and the Coast Guard to build the Catalina PBY.
He built a lot of PBYs. Yes.
And he moved here to San Diego to do that.
That's right. I spent a summer here setting up benches, wiring, plumbing, helping get the plant ready to turn out airplanes.
Now, in 1939, the war had already started in Europe.
Yes.
And the government came to him and wanted him to be a secondary supplier for the B-17 Flying Fortress. He had another idea. Would you tell our viewers?
Well, Fleet and his chief engineer, Mac Ladden, knew they could build a better airplane than the B-17 because, one, they had the Davis wing and advancement in airfoils.
Technically, they had purchased the Davis airfoil.
Yes. They had that, and they had it on a flying boat called the Model 31. And
actually, they never developed the Davis wing for a bomber. It was intended to be a seaplane, right?
It was intended to be a long-range, medium-altitude flying boat. And that was one of the problems with the B-24 when they finally built it. I don't want to get too technical, but just let's say that it was never intended to be flown in formation above 25,000 feet. And neither was the B-17. But it turned out that the B-17 didn't have the Davis wing, so they had put on their airplane an old-fashioned airfoil, the NACA, I don't know, 0018, a symmetrical airfoil. They had, to make it work, they had to put on quite a bit of wing area. And later, when both airplanes were equipped with superchargers and intended to fly at high altitude, that wing area helped the B-17 because at high altitude you needed that big wing to gather enough air to stay up.
Now in the B-24, they added the superchargers on the D model, I believe.
On the Ds, yes.
Now when this plane first flew, they were given 9 months to build it, and it first flew December 29th, 1939, which was 1 day short of the 9-month period.
I was here at the time and saw the first flight. I had gone through college and graduated as an aeronautical engineer and come out to work in the engineering part of Consolidated. So
now you told me that Reuben Fleet was a smart businessman.
He was
tell us what he did with the children of high-ranking officials.
Yeah, well, in between the wars, a major in the Army Air Corps was considered pretty high rank. They ran the Air Corps.
Because all rank was frozen at that time, just about.
Well, in between the wars, nobody very much got promoted.
Eisenhower was a major for 20 years.
My father was a major for 18 years.
Yeah.
I thought Major Royce was one word when I was growing up. Anyway,
when they flew the plane,
Fleet, who had come from the Army Air Corps and knew of many of the officers, had the idea that he would get the sons of these officers to come out and work in the shop, learn to work with their hands, and become familiar with consolidated aircraft, which I think was a good business policy. Nobody that I know ever got invited up to work at Boeing in the summer. So I worked, I think, 6 summers in the shop at Consolidated before I came back into the engineering.
Now, when the plane finally flew, the United States only ordered 7 planes, but France ordered 120, and England ordered 100.
Well, I think more U.S. orders were forthcoming, but the plant capacity was taken up by these other airplanes. And remember, we weren't in the war yet.
Right.
It was only 39 and
right.
40.
Well, actually, France surrendered before they could take delivery on their airplanes, and so in reality, the first B-24s actually went to England.
Well, the first B-24s went to what they call the At-Faro organization. It was a corporation they set up to fly people across the Atlantic. The B-24 was one of the first of the Air Force airplanes that could go across the Atlantic easily. So the first 9, I think, went to At-Faro, and they would fly other airplanes over. They would fly 17s over. They would fly the Lockheeds over, any kind of bombers they fly over. And then the crews would come back on the B-24s.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about some of the new things, or the different things that went into the B-24. First of all, tell our viewers why it had twin tails.
Well, it had twin tails because they took the tail off the Model 31, which was a seaplane, a 2-engine seaplane. And the Navy had a requirement that they have a tail behind each engine. So there were 2 tails. If you had a 4-engine seaplane, they had 4 tails sticking up there.
And it also had tricycle landing gear, which was new. The B-17 was a tail dragger.
That was an innovation, yes.
And there was something else that they had that was new and different. Was it the nacelle? It was elliptical shaped?
Well, when they put the superchargers on the B-24, they wanted a nice, clean configuration for the intercoolers. You see, the supercharger heated up the air and compressed it. And if you put that in the engine would not run with that hot air, so that had to be cooled in between the supercharger and the carburetor. So they made this elliptical nacelle, and you got your air for the oil coolers in one side and for the intercoolers on the other side, and it made a nice, neat, low drag installation.
And they wound up with an airplane that could fly 3,000 miles at 300 miles an hour. And I've been told that they carried a heavier bomb load than the B-17.
They could. They had 2 B-17 bomb bays, one behind the other. So if you wanted to load it up, you could load it up with twice as many bombs as a B-17. When the war started, the higher-ups thought it was incumbent on the U.S. to bomb Tokyo. The problem was they didn't have any airplanes that could fly that far from any base we had.
That's why the Japanese thought they were safe.
That's right. So two projects were put in motion. One was Jimmy Doolittle B-25s off the Hornet. And the other one was called the Halverson Project. They found that the B-24s, which they didn't really have any of but were coming out, could reach Japan from forward bases in China. So,
that would be like Kunming and places like that?
Chengdu, places like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, China was occupied, of course, by the Japanese, but it was not heavily occupied, and they thought some of the local warlords could clear out an area where we could go in and refuel, bomb up, and make one raid on Tokyo. And that was the origin of HALPRO. They only had 3 B-24s then, and they were in accelerated service test in Ohio. And when HALPRO went to get these 3 airplanes, they decided they'd flown them too much to take them to India and China.
And so they made the decision to use the B-25s.
Well, that was already in the works. That was going ahead either one. We were 2 independent raids on Tokyo, but they found they could take 24 of the British B-24 Ds, and we traded some airplanes to the British for them. So they sent those down to get modified, and we trained in them for a few weeks and started across the Atlantic southern route, across Africa, going into India, and then we were going to fly bombs and gas into China and bomb Tokyo. The problem was there were 3 factors. One, Doolittle had bombed Tokyo, so there wasn't all
that. Which made it a moot point.
There wasn't all that urgency. Mm-hmm. We had avenged the insult of Pearl Harbor to a certain extent. And 2, the British were really hurting in the Middle East because Rommel was just about to take Egypt and the canal. And 3, the Italian fleet was loose in the Mediterranean. And 4, Ploesti was turning out a lot of gasoline, and the only airplane that could reach Ploesti was the B-24.
And that's another story.
The British put the heat on us to stay there and do those tasks, which we did.
That's another story that we will cover in another program. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Captain Fred's Aviation Theater. Our next guest is Mac Dyke, who was a pilot of B-24 Liberators in World War II. Mac, let's start out with the gap in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Would you tell our viewers about the 300-mile gap?
Well, the B-24 has got a 110-foot wingspan, and it closed that 300-mile gap.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, the gap was that there was 300 miles in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Correct.
Where other planes couldn't cross. Right. And so the German submarines
had a heyday in there.
They had a field day because they had no problems with the American airplanes there, or British airplanes.
Yes.
And they were operating on the surface. They didn't even bother to submerge.
That's true. And it's amazing the thousands of merchant ships that were sunk in that area because there was no air coverage. But the B-24 was the only plane that could cover that gap in the middle. It could go from England or from the United States and surprised the Germans, surprised the heck out of them. They got bombed on the surface. Didn't know where it came from. And it stopped that carnage.
Put a stop to it. Absolutely. Now, in some kind of a brilliant decision, somebody decided to pull the B-24s out of the Atlantic and use them in Europe, whereupon the loss of tonnage went right back to where it was before, because the submarines on the surface could outrun the corvettes and the other ships, and so they could actually outrun a ship on the surface.
I understand that was true.
And so finally they brought the Liberators back a second time, this time with radar, and that put an end to the German submarine threat.
That's right. The Wolf packs were no more. I mean, they were trying to operate, but they weren't as efficient.
And it was due mostly to the B-24 Liberator.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Another theater that the 24s operated in was the Aleutians. Would you tell our viewers about that? Most people don't realize that Japan actually invaded the United States.
That's right. The islands, there's Attu and I forget some of the other names.
Kiska.
But the Japanese had taken some of those islands, and it was a rough theater up there. Sometimes the planes would land in water. They'd have spraying water, but this B-24 is the only one that could do it. And they eliminated opposition.
And again, it had that tricycle landing gear.
Yes. The tricycle landing gear was the only answer to landing in the Aleutians with a heavy ship.
And because they were flying such short distances,
Yes,
they could carry double the bond load.
Yeah, huge loads.
Now, after the Aleutians, they were sent south to the South Pacific. And would you tell our viewers about that theater?
Well, in the South Pacific, they replaced all the B-17s were there because the missions were long, very long, all the way from, say, 8 hours is probably a short mission, all the way up to 22 hours sometimes on some of the long missions. The only airplane in the world that could carry out a mission of that duration and still come back and still have a bomb loaded.
So the B-17s were pulled,
They were pulled,
and the B-24 Liberators actually owned the South Pacific.
They owned it as far as the warplane or the bombing plane goes, except for minor short runs, maybe down around Australia or something like that. But basically, the B-24s was South Pacific was B-24 country.
Okay. Let's move over to the European theater.
That's my.
They loaded the B-24s with extra guns and extra armament and extra everything else, which really slowed them down and reduced their efficiency. So they needed fighter cover.
Well, that's true, but not all that's true. They were efficient with the load too. I mean, we had firepower. Then one of our nemesis was flak.
And the Focke-Wulf 190.
And the ME-109.
Yeah.
I mean, the ME-109, the Focke-Wulf 190 were no toys. When they came in, especially the group that we got encountered on our second mission was Herman Goring's Abbeville boys. That was his crack outfit. That's when he took over, and we recognized them by their checkered cowlings and the yellow spinners. And when they came in, they took off planes.
Now, we developed 3 long-range fighters that were capable of carrying drop tanks, the extra fuel tanks that they dropped. One was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt.
Correct.
The other one was the Lockheed Lightning P-38.
Yes.
And the third one was the best airplane in the world.
Absolutely.
The North American P-51 Mustang. Now, tell our viewers about the triangle that they flew to give you air cover, fighter cover, over and back. It wasn't the same airplanes.
No, the same airplane. Over the English Channel, you didn't need escort. So the escort planes hadn't even taken off from England yet, unless they were on some sortie other than escort. And then they'd take off and they'd meet and they'd fly in, and then they would be replaced by another one.
Okay, they would fly over from point A to point B of the triangle.
Yes. Then the next group would take over and go
from point B to point C.
And they'd use the gasoline in their tanks first, so they'd have long range. If the Germans had thought about it, they'd have knocked them off before they had got over there and knocked their tanks off, but then they couldn't have gone. Then the ones that came from Berlin, they were not the same airplanes that you escorted earlier. They were a whole different bunch.
And the escort back from C back to D, back to A, was another group. And so you actually had 3 legs of airplanes that were covering you the whole way.
That's right. And boy, were we glad to see them when those deep missions. Of course, when you got over a target, the flak took over, and the escort had to kind of pull off to the side. So the flak took over, but then when that flak left, then the escort came back in to wipe out the German aircraft.
Tell our viewers about the nose art.
Oh, every plane over there had nose art. It was from the bowl to the risque, I guess you might call it. My nose art on my plane was a snark. It was a half snake, half shark, a fighting tool. But my bombardier, after this second mission, went out and he wiped it out. He says, I'm sitting in the middle of a bullseye. But he repainted it much dimmer than that. But there was sentimental nose arc, there was fighting mad nose arc, and then there was bombs on the side.
Yes, I wanted to mention that. I've seen bombs, and then I've seen bombs with a star on top of it. And then I've seen airplanes.
Yes.
So an airplane was one that you shot down.
That's right.
A bomb was a bombing raid. And do you know what a bomb with a star on top of it was?
I probably knew at one time, but at this particular moment, I just...
But that was considered part of nose art.
Yes.
Just like a fighter ace, every time he shot down a plane, he would put up a swastika.
Yes, that's right. And my particular plane had a bunch of bombs on it, and then there was a Purple Heart, a big Purple Heart painted on there because the plane got shot up so bad.
Oh, the airplane was wounded.
Yeah, the airplane got a Purple Heart.
Okay, what else would you like to tell our viewers about the B-24 Liberator?
It was the best fighting machine in the war. I mean, it carried a big load, it went faster, it was very reliable. Naturally, like any other piece of equipment, there were failures, but most of the failures were from enemy attacks, direct hits and stuff like that. But by and large, it came back mortally wounded. It came back sometime. So it was a wonderful aircraft. It flew. It was responsive. I loved it. First time I saw it was when I was in advanced training. I saw one and I thought, gee, fly one of those things? Huge. What a challenge. And after a week in one of them, it was old stuff almost. But it was never old stuff flying him. It was a new thrill every time.
Very good. What would you like to tell our viewers about the B-24 Pilots Association? There's still a lot of people alive who we owe a debt to.
Well, we don't have a pilots association for B-24s per se, but we have organizations like the 2nd Air Division.
Oh, so it's the division or the group rather than the airplane.
And then the 8th Air Force Historical Society was all aircraft that were in the 8th Air Force, 17, the P-51s, the fighter escort, all of those.
Very good. Well, we salute you and we thank you for your service.
Well, it was an honor to answer these questions, but it was a greater honor to serve my country in fighting B-24.
Very good. As always, this is Captain Fred saying, I love airplanes and I honor the people who fly them.
Right downwind. Hold your thing as well. Let me turn it on. Hold it.